The legal advice on the Brexit withdrawal agreement has been released. But do you know what it means? Something historic just happened in Parliament. Theresa May's ministers, her government, were found in contempt of Parliament for the first time in, well, ever in the history of our Parliament. It's the first time that a government's been found in contempt of Parliament. And there's been a huge debate about whether legal advice on her withdrawal agreement should be published. And this is the legal advice that comes from the Attorney General, Geoffrey Cox. Theresa May's not been wanting to publish it, and to be honest, I understood kind of why. They didn't want the EU to have an upper hand to know what they thought in the background. But then Brexiteers have also been arguing for the legal advice to be published because, well, it shows up Theresa May's deal for just how bad it is. And that's what happened. They pushed for the legal advice to be published. Usually, in most circumstances, it shouldn't be published, but there are protocols that allow for it to be published in extreme circumstances. This, of course, being one of them. And a movement in Parliament led by Keir Starmer, the shadow Brexit secretary, forced the government to, well, concede defeat. And Andrea Leadsom, the leader of the House of Commons, had to announce that they would release the legal advice, and so they did. And I thought we'd take a look at the legal advice on Theresa May's withdrawal agreement, try and decode it and turn it into normal English language and not legal jargon, and see what it really means for our future, see what the Attorney General really thinks of Theresa May's deal. So let's start with point 7. Point 7 says that Northern Ireland will stay in the existing customs arrangement and the UK will have only a slightly different arrangement, meaning goods passing from Great Britain to Northern Ireland would still be subject to a declaration process. So some form of border will still exist down the Irish Sea. And this was one of Theresa May's red lines, and she's so clearly crossed it. But we knew this one already. So let's move on to point 16, which talks about the backstop. Now, this point, Cox notes that despite statements in the protocol that it's not intended to be permanent, the backstop should not be permanent, the backstop could endure indefinitely until a superseding agreement takes its place. The withdrawal agreement cannot provide a legal means for compelling the EU to come to an agreement, which means that we wouldn't be able to leave the backstop unless the EU agreed. So we're essentially allowing ourselves to remain within the backstop, remain within a customs union at the will of the European Union. They get to decide when we leave. So when Theresa May says that hopefully we won't even have to go into the backstop because we'll have a deal by 2020, then I certainly hope she's right. Because if we enter that backstop, then we're stuck handing over our sovereignty, and we're stuck in the backstop indefinitely, and only the European Union gets to say when we leave it. Doesn't sound like a great deal to me, Theresa. So let's move on to point 26, which is a bad scenario for the Democratic Unionist Party of Northern Ireland. It says that the deal provides for the EU to argue the protocol is no longer necessary in whole or in part. And because it's no longer necessary in part, the Great Britain element of the customs union could fall away and leave Northern Ireland as the bare minimum required. So what this means is that Northern Ireland will be left within a customs union and the Great Britain wouldn't be, which splits up Northern Ireland and Great Britain and effectively puts a barrier and a border down the Irish Sea. Again, Theresa May's red line. Amazing, isn't it? This means that Northern Ireland will be treated completely differently and gives a foreign power control over the status and the nature of our precious union. The European Union will get control over how the United Kingdom functions. Point 30. Cox finally notes that the protocol does not provide for a mechanism that's likely to enable the UK to lawfully exit the UK-wide customs union without a subsequent agreement. So this means that we're stuck in this customs union with the EU until the EU decides to make a deal with us. And this remains the case even if the parties are still negotiating many years down the line. What he's saying here is it doesn't matter how many years it goes on for. If the EU doesn't want to make a deal with us, then we are stuck. There's no way that says, well, actually, if we haven't made a deal by X amount of time, that we can just leave if we want to. No, it's still down to the European Union. And Theresa May's made a huge deal about how the European Court of Justice will no longer have control of the UK, but the EU is still going to get to control how we function for as long as they like. For many, many years this could go on, even if the parties believe that talks have clearly broken down and there's no prospect of a future relationship agreement. So even if we see no prospect of a future relationship, the EU will still have control. This is the legal advice from our Attorney General, and Theresa May seems to have gone ahead with it anyway. This is serious, and I'm glad this came out. Now, Geoffrey Cox concludes the document, and he explains, "It is important to take into account the changing political context in which it is to operate, and that the solution to any essentially political question is rarely, wholly, or even predominantly legal. In the absence of a right of termination, there is a legal risk that the United Kingdom might become subject to protracted negotiations. This risk must be weighed against the political and economic imperative on both sides to reach an agreement that constitutes a politically stable and permanent basis for their future relationship. This is a political decision for the government." Is it any wonder that Theresa May didn't want the Attorney General's legal advice on the withdrawal agreement to be released? Thank God it was released, and now we can see the deal for just how terrible it is. When Geoffrey Cox says that the risk must be weighed against the political and economic imperative on both sides to reach an agreement that's politically stable, what he's saying is the UK government has essentially decided to throw away our sovereignty, allow the European Union to decide how long we stay in the backstop and therefore how long we stay in the customs union. We're throwing that away just so that we can have some kind of political stability. It shows a lack of faith in our own country and in our own economy. It shows that the British politicians, or at least most of them, don't seem to think that Britain can stand on its own 2 feet in the world. And it's clear that the legal advice shows we are risking our sovereignty in the name of making a good economic deal. It's not a good economic deal. It's not Brexit. And Theresa May herself has said it's a compromise. We have made this process so much more complicated by trying to make it a compromise. Theresa May, what you should be doing is respecting the results of referendum and delivering for the 52% and not for the 48% Ramonas. If you want to see more from me and the rest of the Rebel team, be sure to download the brand new app from the Google Play Store and the Apple App Store.